Okay.
Hi.
Looking up your skirt.
Yeah. Well, we don't know what happened. I don't know if it's a flare or a relapse, but this morning I had a terrible time breathing. I'm in the ER right now. We're going to get a whole bunch of tests done. They're poking and prodding me, as you know, the routine. I'm starting to feel better. But such is life with MS. I'm Cliff, and I'm out.
No, you're not. You're not,
out. I'm not out.
You're definitely in.
Welcome. Well, I spent Saturday in the emergency room, and from what my care team and I can surmise, it is because of my multiple sclerosis. How did this happen? Let's go. As with every experience, there is something that can be taken away, and in this case, I got 5 somethings out of this. It was a very educational weekend, if not just darn right terrifying. If you have recently been diagnosed, or you think you're going to be diagnosed, or you have MS or have had MS for a long time, this video is for you because I guarantee there's some good tidbits of information in here that we can all use. So this video is about an experience with the MS hug. What is the MS hug, you might be asking? I'm not going to get into the clinical definition of it. I'll leave that in the description below. I'll probably link to a Dr. Boster video below. He does a really good explanation of the MS hug. But chances are, if you have MS, whether you know it or not, you've probably experienced the MS hug. I didn't know it when I started my first symptoms, and then it all just started to make sense. Again, this video is about the MS hug. Now, what does the MS hug feel like? Well, this was a unique experience, but I'd say in general, it almost feels like having your back against a wall and then having somebody pull a car up against your chest and just rest their foot on the accelerator until you're just getting smushed. It's just everything's just like, and I personally have experienced it all over my body. It has not just been the torso, it has been in my hips, it has been in my legs. It just feels like someone's really squeezing hard. But I've never experienced it to a level like I experienced it this weekend, and that caused a lot of issues. Now, this video is not meant to be medical advice. I am not a healthcare provider. I am just a bald dude on YouTube with multiple sclerosis sharing his experience, hoping that maybe someone else out there sees it and goes, "Oh, I'm not going crazy. This happens to other people too." And that's primarily the reason I started this YouTube channel, is so that we could all share knowledge and know we're not all crazy, because MS is a tricky, tricky, tricky disease, and it's different in everybody. It does have some little common underthreads where we all kind of connect, but it's a very different experience for every single person. You're not crazy. Well, maybe you're crazy, and maybe I'm crazy, but we both have MS, and that's not the crazy part of us, so that's good news, right? Okay, so let's roll back the clock 2 weeks, because context is very important for this particular situation that happened. I contracted a pretty nasty respiratory infection that was, I think, bacterial in nature, because I ended up taking antibiotics to take care of it, and it worked. However, the strange thing is, about 2 days before I got a fever from this bacterial infection, I had like the MS hug in my torso and in my hips and in my legs so bad I couldn't sleep at night. I mean, everything was just cramping up and feeling like I was being squished alive. And I thought, I'm just going to get through this. I'm not going to take any muscle relaxers because I'm already fighting fatigue like crazy. And I will just push through this. And so that lasted about 2 days. I would just go out on really long walks and see if I could loosen it up. And the exercise helped. It didn't alleviate the pain, but it definitely helped. And then I started getting really sick with the lung infection, and that left me in bed for 2 or 3 days. Literally, the fatigue from the MS and then the lung infection was so bad, I could not move out of bed for more than like 10 minutes without being just so fatigued I'd drop to the floor. So I just had to lay around in bed, watch really stupid shows, and wait for this thing to kind of resolve. Well, it didn't start resolving on its own until I got antibiotics and got the stuff out of my lungs. And then it resolved pretty quickly. All the while, the MS seemed to be gaining popularity in my system with symptoms. There was all kinds of stuff going on. My vision was not doing well. My breath, my my head was buzzing a lot. My arms were going numb and all this stuff. And I'm thinking it's just MS overreacting to an infection because my immune system's going, oh my God, we got an infection. We got to go destroy everything. And I just happened to be in the way. And so fast forward a little bit to a couple days after the infection kind of clears up, I start exercising mildly again just to kind of get my lungs reinflated and feeling normal. And that was last week around Wednesday. By Friday, I was feeling okay. Then Friday morning, I didn't feel well. I just felt like MSy, like super fatigued. And my head was buzzing. The cog fog was really bad. I was on a conference call with some people and I just had no idea what was going on. And I realized about midday that I was dealing with a pretty nasty little flare up. So I went and picked up my son from school and I came home, and just picking him up from school fatigued me so bad that I could no longer stand. And I went and I laid down in bed for about an hour and a half. And then that night, I ended up going to bed really early because I felt terrible. I told Andrea, my wife, and my kid, Gavin, I said, guys, I'm sorry. I got to go to bed. It's like 7 o'clock on a Friday night, but I'm just feeling really crappy and I just want to sleep off this MS. So that night I had like these little pseudo fevers. I don't know if you ever get those. Please comment below if you do. Like they feel like fevers, but they're not fevers. Like I keep a thermometer next to my bed and I check at night. I'm like, am I really having a fever or is this just MS? And like 9 times out of 10, I feel like I'm having a flu-like fever, but it's not. I'm not actually hot. I just feel like I'm hot. It's just bizarre. Anyway, so I had a couple of those that night. And Saturday morning I woke up and my arms were a little bit numb and my head was feeling very strange. And my wife was telling me I was saying some weird things. I don't remember exactly what. I do remember I had a lot of ideas around a project I wanted to do, and I was kind of jumping from one thing to the other. But I think I was trying to cover up the fact that I just wasn't feeling good. So I was focusing on other things. Anyway, I ended up hopping in the shower around 9 a.m., get in the shower, and I get out. And it's not unusual for me to be very fatigued after getting in the shower. However, I couldn't breathe and I was gasping. I was like, oh man, this is just not, I just was not feeling good. And so I went and I laid down for about 30 or 40 minutes and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse to the point where I just feel like I was not getting any oxygen. And it was just an extreme amount of manual labor to try to get oxygen in, and it was fatiguing me even more. And so I took my little albuterol inhaler they gave me for my lung infection, and it didn't do anything other than I think raise my heart rate. But I could not catch my breath. So I went to go to the other side of the house to tell Andrea that I'm not feeling well. Can you just keep an eye on me? By the time I got there, the other side of the house, which is not very far, I was in serious trouble. Like my heart rate was going crazy. I was starting to see stars and I couldn't even stand up. And so I collapsed on a bed that we have on the other side of the house. And I asked Andrew to bring in the blood pressure cuff and the pulse oximeter. The pulse oximeter is the one that measures the oxygen in your blood that they put on your finger. And I just wanted to see for myself, like, what in the heck is going on here? So first I put the blood pressure cuff on and it is going bonkers. Like it's 140 over 90, which is way out of my range. I'm usually like 122 over 70. Pretty healthy in that regard. So to have it that high is crazy. And then my pulse was 110. Now, mind you, I'm laying down. And I know enough to know that, like, because I have a Fitbit, my pulse is usually around 65. 110 as a resting heart rate at that moment was crazy. And it could have been the inhaler. I don't know. And the oxygen was still reading like 97, 98, which was really weird because I felt like I couldn't breathe at all. And I said, Andrew, there's something going on here. You need to call an ambulance because I'm really starting to freak out. And meanwhile, everything's getting harder and harder to breathe. And I think at this point, I'm going into like a full on panic attack because I'm an engineer. I like to know why things are happening, and nothing is making sense at this point. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm going into a panic attack, but at the same time, I'm totally conscious of what's happening. And I'm watching my telemetry with all my devices, and things are going weird. Like I'm trying to breathe, but I'm losing O2 in my blood. Like I'm down to like 95. By the time the ambulance gets here, I'm down to 90 oxygen saturation, which is kind of concerningly low. And my whole body is shaking like crazy, which is probably part of a panic attack. But everything just starts cramping and cramping and cramping. So they put O2 on me and they ask me a bunch of questions. And I tell them, listen, I've got pretty chronic MS. This could be a flare, a spasm, a relapse. I don't know what's going on, but I can't breathe. And that's the biggest issue right now. And so they throw me in the ambulance and they hook me up to oxygen and they test my heart for heart attacks because that was kind of a concern. Also, a blood clot from being stagnant from the infection for so long was also a concern. So they race me off to the hospital. Meanwhile, they're pumping me full of fluids with IVs and stuff, and I start feeling a little bit better, but I'm very nauseous. We get to the hospital and they bring in a portable x-ray machine and they x-ray my lungs immediately because they thought there was a blood clot given my history in the last week or 2 weeks where I just wasn't moving a lot because of my sickness. So they're taking x-rays and they come back and they say, okay, we don't see any blood clots. We don't see anything that's going to be like terminal here within the next 5 minutes. If we don't fix it, let's throw you in the MRI. So they throw me in the MRI and they give me a thoracic, cervical, and head. And they're like, yeah, your MS is everywhere in your spine, which I already knew this, everywhere in your head and in your neck, blah, blah, blah. But they did give me contrast, and there's nothing active at the moment. While I'm trying to do the I can't sit still because my body is just flinching and stuff. And I keep telling them, this is like a 2.5 hour process because they were doing a very comprehensive scan. And I keep telling them, I'm ringing the buzzer and saying, I need to come out. I need to stretch because I cannot sit still long enough for you guys to get the images. My legs were cramping and my toes started doing this weird thing. And meanwhile, my chest is getting tight again and loosening and getting tight. And by this time, I realized I'm just having like severe cramping all over my body, muscle spasms, right? So I get out of the MRI. They were really cool. They worked with me on it. It took way longer than it should have. And they put me back in the room to monitor me for a little while they get the stuff taken care of. They do the blood tests and they look at the radiologist looks and makes up the report and all that stuff. And they come back and they're like, well, you're not going to die from anything. And actually, you're in really good health overall. Um, but your MS is really messing with you right now. And you're having really bad spasms. And I said, well, yeah, I knew that. But so the reason I'm telling you this is because it was a very scary experience. And I learned a lot from it. And we'll get into those lessons here in a second. But I think it was a turning point in my MS. I've never had to call an ambulance before. I've never been that afraid of not being able to breathe. I've never had the symptoms that bad. And I've often heard that the symptoms, even if the disease isn't technically progressing, the symptoms get worse with age. So I'm trying to keep that in mind. So as I'm checking out of the hospital, by the way, I always ask to get my DICOM MRIs, which is basically a disc with all the images on it and not just the report. I recommend you do that. That's a power tip, pro tip from an MSer. Keep a record of all those things. Get it on CD so you have your images so you can take them to people and they can look at them. You can compare them over time. They won't compare exactly because they're taken at different times, but with different machines. But the point is, you have points of reference with that stuff. And I've got a stack of them like this high, and they always serve me well. So get your images from your radiology department, and it usually takes them 30 to 40 minutes to make them. It's not a big deal, and I don't think I've ever been charged for them. So be sure you ask. And they're yours. They're your records. You're getting charged for that MRI. You might as well have a hard copy of what happened while you were in that machine. But now I want to get into the 5 things this weekend taught me, and I'm just going to start. And they're not really in order of importance. They're more just the top 5 things I think I will take forward with me. And number 1, and this is something I debated with in my head for a while, was, did I overreact by calling an ambulance and going to the ER? And as I thought about it, as I spoke with friends and also the people in the healthcare field, they said, hell no, you didn't overreact. And here's why. I didn't know if I was having a heart attack or not. And my MS was playing games with me by sending a lot of different signals. And it could have been any number of very serious conditions that MS looks like. And there's really no way to rule those out on your own without the help of the experts. So I don't think I overreacted because I didn't know how close I was to not being able to breathe at all. And I think based on what I saw with the telemetry, the PulseOX and all that stuff, I don't think I was ever in any real danger, but my brain thought I was in real danger and it was in flight mode because it was getting mixed signals due to my MS and it thought I was suffocating. I didn't overreact by calling the ambulance and going to the ER. I was responding to a situation I thought was actually happening, even though it wasn't. Thank you, MS. Huh, I love that. Ugh, that's crazy, right? And I know that's happened to most people with MS. And as for actually being in the ER, getting the immediate feedback from the X-ray techs about there's no immediate danger in my body brought a huge level of relief that I couldn't have gotten at home. I would have been guessing, even if the spasms had reduced at home and I would have worked through the panic attack, I would have been guessing even up until today, maybe I should have gone because maybe I do have a blood clot that hasn't broken loose yet. Like there are just these things that sit on my mind. I would have never thought about that had I not had an infection in the lungs earlier, but it was definitely, I think, a legitimate concern. Okay, so let's talk about number 2. Can we as people with MS overreact, and should we feel bad about it? Well, that kind of ties into number 1, but hell no, we should not feel bad about overreacting. Our reality is what we're being presented with at the moment, and our MS can really screw with that reality. So, and what I mean by that is we might be perceiving something that's not actually happening, but we're getting the electrical signals in our brain that make it appear as though we are. It's like we're living in our own little MS simulation, and what we feel, see, hear, and think is true to us. And if we think we're in legitimate danger, then we need to react accordingly. So I'm not going to feel bad about being stuck in a situation like that and calling for help. I just I'm going to let that go. It used to be a thing I think would have really like bugged me because I would have thought to myself, "Oh, I can work my way out of this." I'm getting better at that. I'm getting better at relying on those around me that know my condition and are there to help. So if you get stuck in that situation, I recommend don't feel bad about it. It's the last thing we need is more guilt about this disease. Number 3, it's easy to blame MS, but what if it's not MS? And that's the risk, right? Like I often get a lot of different things and I can write them off as MS. But I fear the day that I get a really bad symptom of something and I'm like, "Oh, it's just MS, it's gonna go away." And what if it is an actual heart attack? I have to be careful about blaming MS for everything because it's a little bit of a habit because in the past that has been true. Most of the time it is MS, but let's be honest, I'm getting older. There might be real situations coming up that aren't MS and some of them are much more dangerous than MS. Number 4, my panic switch is no longer in my control when I get to that level. When I get to the realization that I can't breathe or I feel like I can't breathe, my panic is like, okay, you are really in a situation here you need to resolve quickly. We're taking over. And of course, our brains take over and start running that show. And our brains are not really good at managing those situations, especially when we have MS. They just start throwing stuff at situations of trying to fix it, and that's not good. Like, "Oh, he might be cold, let's warm him up by making him shiver," or, "Let's give him a couple spasms down there to break something loose," or, "Yeah, but we don't know what's going on, but we're just gonna throw it against the wall and see what happens." From an engineering perspective, that never turns out well. Brain, did you hear that? Ju just don't throw stuff at the wall, and that is the flight response of the brain, and in this situation, it got way out of control, wildly out of control, but I was still very with it cognitively, and I knew what was going on. I wanna talk a little bit more about that not having control of my emotions and my panic and all that stuff, because it is an actual situation with MS, and if you're experiencing MS and you're not aware of this, there are situations that can make us cry when we should be laughing, there are situations that can make you laugh when you should be crying. And I'll give you an example of this. Before I was diagnosed, this is when I very first knew there was something going on that was terribly wrong at like a mechanical, electrical, mechanical level. I had a very dear friend of mine, and we were very close. And he was decapitated in a car wreck at a young age. And he had such a bright future in front of him. And he was just the coolest guy. And I went to his funeral with all my other friends. And it was deeply sad. I was in despair because I was like, "Oh my gosh, my good friend, is now dead. I'm never gonna see him again. I never had a chance to say goodbye and all that stuff." Um, I was very sad. And when all of my friends and I were walking out of the church, I just started busting up laughing, like uncontrollably. But there were tears coming out of my eyes because I was so freaking sad. And again, this is before I knew I had MS. And I'm like, what in the world is going on? And everybody's looking at me going like, dude, you're kind of a psycho. Why are you laughing right now? Someone has just died and it's very sad. And I was trying to explain, yeah, I'm sad, but my body's not interpreting it as sadness. Like my brain is showing the reaction of laughter. And it was bizarre to me. Now, of course, we do know this is a thing, and it's called the Pseudobulbar effect. I will link that below. And I have noticed with my age, it has actually gotten worse. I find myself laughing at things that are not funny, and I find myself crying at things that are not sad. And it's just bizarre, but I know what's happening now. So my wife and I just kind of giggle about it when it happens because it's silly. But when you don't know what's happening, it's terrifying. So the fact that you have the brain wires that are mixed up there and they're throwing out different emotions can really play havoc. And I think that has a lot to do with some of the panic situation as well. Number 5. Now, I'm not showing any progression in my disease as far as we can tell. Like I had contrast and we didn't see any active lesions happening, but the symptoms seem to be getting worse. And if I look at a lot of stuff online, which we know to be true, not, it seems to be that your symptoms can get a lot worse, but that doesn't mean your disease is getting worse. And if that's not confusing, I don't know what is. And so my MS hug, it's a symptom I've had forever. It was one of my first symptoms, but it seems to be getting worse. But I'm not having any progression in my disease but this experience demonstrated that, yeah, my symptoms are getting worse even if my disease is not. So these are the 5 things I kind of learned this week. I do feel empowered by this week because when I can break down something and learn something from a traumatic event like this, it really does provide some level of comfort. Like, I'm not totally nuts. This stuff's really happening to me. And if we can take away positives from this week, is that I can share this story with you, and if it helps you, fantastic. If it helps somebody else, awesome. That's why I started this channel. I'll always share this kind of stuff with you guys because I think it's super important that we all know we're somewhat in the same boat and we can be comfortable about talking about these things. We don't have to be clinicians, we don't have to be doctors. We're patients. We live it every single day, and we have our own little tips, tricks, and hacks to living with this disease. And I think we should share those. So here I am. I'm Cliff. This is Life with MS. And thank God I'm not out. I'll talk to you soon.